Good afternoon if you're in North America. Well, I guess most of the morning's gone. Um, and uh, and good evening if you're tuning in from the United Kingdom or the Middle East. And an early good morning to you, Christian. My guest today is Cristian Sylvestre. He's the author of Third Generation Safety, using brain science to improve human behavior. I'm not sure if I've got it all right, but certainly I've worked with Christian for years, since 2008. And although I might never have actually said this to his face, his book had a huge influence on me in terms of being able to finally confirm some of the things that had been working for a while. And I thought about it yesterday, going, interesting that the things that didn't work, I didn't need confirmed by Christian's book because it had already been confirmed in the real world that it didn't work and it was dead. So kind of it kind of made sense that the stuff that worked would actually be confirmed by the neuroscience that came out. So Christian, I don't know if I've ever formally thanked you for all of that, but it was huge. It was huge for me, mate. So thanks again for coming on board.
No, pleasure, Larry. Good to be here.
Yeah. Now, Christian also has a great, he's from Australia. It's sort of a national requirement that you have a sense of humor in Australia. I can't imagine how badly you'd be ostracized if you didn't. But my guess is, though, you never met an Australian that didn't have a good sense of humor. Um, but Christian's book is also easy to read, and it's a bit fun to read. And a lot of books on safety, behavior, and psychology definitely help you if you're an insomniac. But you wouldn't necessarily say it was a page turner, that's for sure. So good on you for that one too, Christian. Making it easy
Thanks,
to
Larry.
read as well. Now, you've been interested in safety for a long time, degree in chemical engineering, master's in environmental engineering. Then you went and worked for one of the biggest oil companies in the world.
hmm
And I know that kind of goes back and forth with mergers and acquisitions, but still, that company's still way up there. And I remember you telling an anecdote when you would be talking to the groups we were presenting to in Australia about when you were at Shell, a senior employee got hurt, and your instructions were that you needed to go and reindoctrinate this employee. And you said, "Well, this is the guy. He's been here 34 years. He's the one we use to train all of the new employees."
hmm
You know, well, you can't do nothing, so away you go because you have to fill this form in. So I think that's what you said back then was, if you will, kind of the turning point in terms of, we got to move beyond the box we're in. This is done as much as it's going to do. But
hmm
what got you so interested in the neuroscience? Just because you're kind of an engineering, like brilliant guy like that, and you wanted.
Well, thanks. You're being too kind. So look, I see myself as a science person, and the important thing about that is that I've seen lots of different approaches to safety, um, but I've always focused on where the evidence is. So people tend to think that there's an infinite number of programs out there that deal with safety, but when you start distilling them, it comes down to three things that we're trying to do: fix the environment, improve the system, or make safety more conscious. So those are the three things that most programs try to land on, and they work, but they work up to a point. So when you go looking for evidence, right, for instance, workplace fatalities in Australia, they've been plateauing now for 8 years, since 2013, 2014. Now, interestingly enough, you look at workplace fatalities in the States, and during the same period, they've increased by about 15%. And that's even though we do those three approaches that I mentioned before more than we've ever done them before, and we do them better than we've ever done them before. So when you think about that in that context, something's not adding up. And to me, the data doesn't lie. Right? Now, that's kind of where the evidence needs to be. So when you get, when you get when the choice is you need to make in the face of objective evidence, you've got two choices. You can either ignore the evidence, shore up your assumptions, and continuing believing whatever it is that you want to believe, whatever that story happens to be, or you can use it to challenge your assumptions and update your story to something that's slightly better. So my nature, I guess, is that I've always gone for the second. I always look at the evidence and I always try and work out if there's something that I need to change internally. And when I started to challenge my assumptions because of the things that sort of story that you mentioned and a few others, I found that the best evidence came from neuroscience. So that's what got me started, and I started looking into it in order to try and understand better the kind of stuff that happens in people's heads that determines how they behave.
Yeah, for me, at the time when the neuroscience was coming out, Safe Start, other than in Australia with you internationally, was being distributed by a different company. And they had some folks who were delving into new findings on neuroscience, and they were also trying to sort of put that out into sort of safety training programs for leaders, supervisors, and in some cases employees. And I know that some of that also happened in Australia or was originated in Australia. So now this is the interesting thing, because our community and the attention span for things in the safety world is interesting. It's shorter than science. So in other words, even if you've got something like science that proves it, that doesn't mean you're going to remain there's the neuroscience was a huge thing. I was speaking on it, all over, quoting your book, but North America, South America, Europe, Middle East, India, the Philippines, and people were flocking for a couple of years almost to go see it, right? Because it was like the shiny new thing. And I was trying to say, no, it's science this time, you guys. I know you've had a lot of experience with the shiny new thing, and sometimes there's been so many TMPs, like different three-letter acronym programs bandied around as the new latest thing. But tell me, I guess the next part I think would be what the neuroscience has that, it enables us to see inside the brain, and what actually is happening in there. So as it relates to safety, maybe, Cristian, can you sort of tie that together for us in terms of how people can make some real meaningful connections with this in terms of safety?
Yeah, so most people are aware of what an MRI is, right? So my doctor sort of sends me off to get an MRI. He gets a picture, he looks at the picture, he makes a diagnosis, and then he gives me the best treatment. So about maybe 13, 14 years ago, they invented a new piece of technology, a functional MRI. So a functional MRI doesn't give you a picture. What it does is it actually maps blood flow as it's happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a neuroscientist can grab that and can see which parts of the brain are working depending on what is being done, because blood flows to the part of the brain or to the part of the body that's actually needs it. So for the first time in human history, we're now able to see exactly what's going on in people's heads as it's happening. It's a game changer.
Oh, yeah.
So if you put somebody's head into an fMRI and you show them a picture of a snake, their amygdala lights up. Why? Because that's the fear center of the brain. The other thing that happens is that blood flow, you can actually see the restrictions in the blood vessels that go to the prefrontal cortex, where you do most of your reasoning. Because when you're really fearful, your conscious mind goes offline. And the other thing that we learned was that brain chemicals come into play when for critical moments, like when we're rushing, frustrated, or fatigued. And other brain chemicals help us pre-program our autopilot response. Now, as it turns out, these brain chemicals control and influence what we do to a degree we never imagined, and help us explain why people do what they do, why people make such poor in the moment decisions, right, that leads to a whole bunch of safety incidents. But all that happens below our level of conscious awareness. And because it happens below our level of conscious awareness and we're not aware of it, we give it absolutely no credit at all. And the kind of work that I do is to try and get people to understand that there's an aspect of human behavior that comes from a place that we're not aware of. But it's important to understand that if we want to be able to do something else apart from fix the environment, improve the system, or make safety more conscious.
Right. Well, and certainly, anybody who is high performance athlete or has been a high performance athlete, you were a very high level squash player. I was a legend in my own mind on the basketball court, but yeah, I was this close to the NBA, almost got front row seats. But yeah, but you know enough about the zone is all I'm getting at. You don't actually have to be Michael Jordan to understand that. And that sort of crept into the performance aspect of all of this as well, in terms of, people wanting to be able to find the zone, because we all know the power of the zone as well too. Like, what we don't know is how to get into it reliably, which is why there's more superstitions like lucky socks and lucky chain and all the rest of it that goes on. Even the team's sort of warm-up routine never changing, because everybody's kind of knows that some of this stuff kind of works and some of it doesn't. So the aspects though of the chemicals and I never pronounced it properly, the amygdala hijack and amygdala hijack. Yeah. I mean, that whole part people have kind of understood intuitively for years. But for whatever reason, even if it had happened to them before, I made a bad decision because I was rushing, or I said something I shouldn't have said because I was frustrated, or I tried to do something when I was too tired and I messed it all up. Instead of even being able to learn from experience, people find themselves in the same situation over and over again. Is that when you explain to people about the hijack, does it help them? I mean, does it motivate them to start putting, because you can retrain some of this. If you don't have to be a victim, I think is a big part of what you guys do when you're helping people.
Yeah, look, and the way that we pitch it is that we say to people, when we start the training, we say, this is not about, making better choices. I mean, safety can be about making better choices. It can be about the system. It can be about, getting rid of the hazard. But what we teach is we tell people that this is about you and the control you have over what happens to you. Right? Because when you think about rushing, frustration, fatigue, and complacency, I prefer the word autopilot, but let's put that to the side for the time being. It all happens in your head. So what's the good news? Well, the good news is that you've got some control, but you might be wired in a way where your control is limited. Right? So we give people an opportunity to do something different and rewire themselves in a way that would that would enable them to get a bit more control. And interestingly enough, when people have more control because they kind of, they practice the things that we talk about, psychological safety improves. I mean, it's not something that I ever kind of targeted with the work that SafeStart does or the work that we do, but people are saying to me, I don't feel as frustrated as I used to. I don't feel, like, I've got no control, because I know that whatever the world throws at me, at least I've got some control about how I'm going to react or respond.
Well, Cristian, I think just from the world's safety, I mean, we should be thanking you for introducing that concept of control versus blame. I remember reading in your book, could I have exerted more control in this situation? Yes or no? Is much different than this is your fault and you are, damned to eternity somewhere. I mean, the idea of extending, would you like more control, is much more appealing than, less like the idea of, like, I get this still about you're blaming the worker. You're blaming the worker. We all know you need to fix the system, that, human error is inevitable. And I'm going, no, it isn't. Like, you don't lose your balance every minute, every hour, sometimes not even every day, but we all lose our balance at least a couple times a week.
Yeah.
So we could prevent it too, right? If we were exerting more control in the moment. And I think the other thing that you touched on that was really important was that, yes, it can be about decisions, but then everybody, they good or evil. Well, if you've got evil people working for you, you got to get rid of them. So if it's just good people, and you've got rid of the people that are stealing all your office supplies and stuff, and if you've got good people, what are the chances that they were trying to make a bad decision versus their decision being influenced by something like one of those factors? And we've all made bad decisions because of rushing frustration. Most of us say, listen, I don't even want to decide this now, I'm too tired. I want to decide in the morning. But sometimes if you're pressed for a decision when you're tired, you pick the one that's the least effort.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, everybody's had compromised decisions because of that, Cristian. So I think that was a huge plus that you added for all of us. What about I guess the question I should be asking you now is, can you put it all together so that we can understand how the brain works when it comes to behavior? And then I love this next question. Why do so many people get stuck on safety is only conscious? Oh, I deal with that all the time. So,
so let's talk about what the neuroscience has found initially, and then we'll try and put it all together and explain to people what's going on inside their heads or inside people's heads. So brain science shows that up to 95% of what we do originates in the subconscious. It originates in the subconscious, a part of the brain that we are not aware of. So when we talk to people, I say to them, think about it in this way. Think about which mind is really in charge. There's conscious over here, there is subconscious over here. They both influence behavior. We're only aware of the conscious, so we think that is all there is. But there's the subconscious also that's doing stuff that you don't know about, which is, much more powerful, to the tune of 95-5. So what the neuroscience is really saying is that behavior is more of a back of mind function than a front of mind function, even though it feels to you and to me about it being a front of mind function. We think that we're making conscious decisions about everything. Now, and when I put it all together, I'll explain why that is. But in order to get people to understand what it is that we're talking about, during the training, we ask them a series of questions. So we say to them, okay, let's look at a few examples here. When you get in your car in the morning, what do you do first? Do you put your seatbelt on or do you turn it on?
Well, if you're old, you turn it on first and then you put the seatbelt on, usually.
When you get changed in the morning to get to work, do you put your sock on your left foot first or your right foot first?
Right.
And this one was working really good for me until I went to this place in the back of Woodwhoop, and it made me aware that assumptions sometimes don't work everywhere. So I asked, what do you do first? Do you brush your teeth first or do you shower first? And somebody at the back said, I don't do either. And everybody in the room turned around and went, we know.
We know.
So the important thing The important thing that I say to them is, look, whether you know or don't know doesn't really matter. What matters is to recognize that you do the same thing every day without a lot of conscious thought, because you've done it plenty of times before. So that was makes it subconscious, under the surface.
Yeah, Cristian, I've been asking literally thousands and thousands of people since then, how much of your day or your week are you doing something new that you haven't done before, where it would be unlikely you'd go on autopilot? In other words, I was in New York City on the weekend for first time in over 20 years. You could go on autopilot, but it was much more difficult than when I lived there to go on, to go on autopilot, right? So thinking about, okay, when is your mind, your best self-defense device, not likely going to be with you, right? And it's the average is 95% is what people think, Chris.
Yeah,
that's do something. I'm doing something new that would force my attention.
Yeah. So it is consistent with what neuroscience is telling us about how much originates in the subconscious, right? Right? So you ask people and they kind of give you a sort of consistent answer. So the interesting thing for us is that, when you're doing things in autopilot, for instance, you're aware of what you're doing, but you're not making active conscious decisions at every point. Because if you were making active conscious decisions at every point before you got to work, you would probably need a nap by the time you got in. Right? But this fellow that I was telling you about, he put his hand up and goes, mate, because that's kind of how people sort of get your attention in Australia. He said, look, I can put my socks on in autopilot because there's no danger involved, there's no safety issue. But I would never allow myself to go on autopilot if I was doing something dangerous. Right? And I said to him, all right, let's look at the most dangerous thing you're likely going to do today. Drive home. Have you ever driven home and can't remember much? And he went, yeah. And I go, well, which mind was in charge then? And he looked at me and he went, oh, I guess it's the subconscious. So I explained to him that the reason why we can't remember much when we do things in autopilot is because our memories get laid down very flimsily and they're very difficult to recollect. So then I said, can I ask you a follow-up question? And I said, so by the time you decided to go to your car, was there a point in time where you consciously decided to hand over control to your subconscious, or did it happen automatically? And he went, oh, no, I can't think of a time. And I go, well, because it happens without our knowledge, without our awareness, and it happens without our permission. It happens automatically.
That's the one I get people with all the time, Cristian. I said, you've been driving for a couple of years. I said, it's not like you or me or anybody else said, well, I think I got this now so I can drive on autopilot. We all ended up driving on autopilot, but not one of us made a decision to do it.
Exactly.
Right? Exactly. And so, you can also talk about the reticular activating system and trying to get people, like you go to the swimming pool, you smell the chlorine, 15 minutes later, you don't smell the chlorine. You didn't make a decision to do that. And what's really interesting is you can go around trying really hard to smell the chlorine and you still can't smell it, right? So the other thing I tell people is that this subconscious of yours isn't easily fooled. It isn't easily retrained, but it can be fooled and it can be retrained, right? And you do a great job in your trainings, Cristian, of showing people, different optical illusions, right? Saying, you believe this, but it's not true. The boat can't be floating, right? So you've got all this conflict going on, and your prefrontal cortex just can't believe sort of what I just think it's so powerful how instant the subconscious is as well too, right? And that's what I'm telling people. We got to train, like if you want reflex speed, you don't get, like, the prefrontal cortex has only got a 4-cylinder engine. It's 10 years old. If you want speed, you got to get it. You got to get it from the twin turbos here at the back, right? That's where it's going to come from.
Yeah.
But
And look, that's
training
really,
the twin turbos isn't
yeah,
going to be just like that.
yeah. Yeah. So, and what I say to people is we're biologically wired to go on autopilot when we do things that are familiar, right? So, autopilot is a preferred operating mode of the brain. Why? As you said, because it's quick and it uses minimal energy, right? So when we do something familiar, it feels safe, right? And when it feels safe, what happens is that we release endocannabinoids, and those endocannabinoids sort of change the gears, I guess, from goal-oriented activity to habitual activity. So that's kind of how it happens. So, and what you were saying is right as far as the conscious mind is concerned as well, because the conscious mind is very good for new, novel, or different things, but it is slow and it uses a lot of energy.
Right.
So the brain wants to use a habit in order to get things done because it's much more efficient. But the problem is that when you're using habits, especially for something that you've done plenty of times before, you don't think about it much. Inattention comes into play, and therefore you increase the chances of having an incident. So when you think about it, the way in which I sort of say to people is that, your conscious mind isn't baseline behavior. Autopilot is your baseline behavior, right? And if you ask yourself, what does neuroscience say about other things that influence behavior? Well, rushing and frustration. And what the neuroscience has found is that there is a cocktail of chemicals released when you feel threatened, things like adrenaline and cortisol, and that causes the conscious mind to be temporarily sidelined. So I sort of mentioned that a little bit earlier. How does that manifest itself in behavior? Well, we become tunnel vision about the outcome, and we become obsessed with what gets in our way, and we behave more impulsively. And with that impulsivity, you get a bit of inattention as well. That's not about sociology, psychology, or culture. That is brain biology at work, right?
Right.
And the other thing that influences behavior, because you've got the conscious, you've got so they've got the conscious, and in the subconscious, you've got autopilot, rushing frustration, and the next one is fatigue. So what the neuroscience shows is that when we're using our brain, because you get fuel and oxygen, we get energy, and we also get waste products. Those waste products accumulate in your brain and progressively clog up the ability of brain cells to communicate with each other. And we find it increasingly difficult to think things through or to pay attention. So that's why we tend to wane towards the later part of the day. So sleep and rest clean out our brain, and that's why we feel so refreshed and clear-headed after a good night's sleep, and so lethargic when we don't have a good night's sleep. Right? So there are those four brain modes: conscious, autopilot, rushing and frustration, which I tend to put together because the neuroscience is relatively similar, and then fatigue. So how does that manifest itself into behavior? Now, I'm going to use a prop
Question,
to explain this.
can
Yeah?
you also use some exercise, like physical exercise, like treadmill, the bike, whatever, to clear out some of the brain fog chemicals from the sleep as well?
Yep.
Or not
So,
from the fatigue, rather, as
yeah, yeah,
opposed to just sleep. I mean, I know the best is sleep, but you
yeah.
can also kind of, if you get your blood going and you're not actually cranking your head hard, like walking and relaxing your head, but walking fast, can you also clear it out a bit that way too?
Yeah. So that's a fairly good short-term solution.
Right.
And you get things like caffeine, and what caffeine does. So the waste products that gets released when we're fatigued is the adenosine triphosphate. If you know any biology, ATP, which is the main way that energy gets fed into the cells. So what we find is that caffeine blocks the adenosine receptors in the neurons. So therefore, you kind of the communication gets, I don't know, gets a little bit of a helping hand in the short term, is the best way that I can that I can put it. So let me get my prop. This is Brian the Brain. Okay. Now, Brian the Brain, so I'll show you what that is. Okay. My children named Brian the Brain because, well, Brian sounds like the brain. And do you ever watch that Tom Hanks movie Castaway when he catches himself talking to a, yeah. Okay. So
Wilson.
Brian and I have,
Yeah.
sorry?
Wilson is the name. It's his
Wilson,
father.
that's right. So I've caught myself having conversations with Brian the Brain when I'm in a hotel somewhere asking him what he wants to have for dinner. Anyway, another story. So when we look at the brain and we ask ourselves, okay, so what's going on in there? So we've got a prefrontal cortex, which is the bit that's sort of behind your forehead over here, and that's where you do most of your reasoning. It's a small part of the brain. And then what we have, and that's where we do the processing. So processing, conscious mind, prefrontal cortex, they tend to go together. But we need to have something that tells the brain what to process. That tends to be the subconscious, the limbic system. So if I turn this around, okay, you might sort of be able to see all those sort of bits and pieces in there, like things like the hippocampus and the amygdala and the striatum. Those are part of the limbic system without getting too much into it, all right?
Okay.
So I might sort of use this way first. Okay, so if we look at what goes on in order to cause behavior. So behavior is the output of whatever process is taking place in the brain. The last step before behavior happens is the conscious mind. It's the processing. So the time between when the conscious mind becomes aware, because we don't know what's happening sort of this way at all. So the last step is the conscious mind. So the time between the conscious mind and behavior is relatively small. We're not aware of anything else that's taking place either. So that's why we tend to think that everything's conscious, okay? Because we become aware, it happens, and we don't know what else brought it to our attention. So that's why we think it's conscious. But what brain science shows is that what the conscious mind processes is fed up to it by the subconscious. And the subconscious works in a series of internal patterns, if you like. And internal patterns, what I mean by that is that they're kind of models of what we expect to happen based on the outcomes of previous experiences. So they're scripted responses to things we have seen plenty of times before. How do those internal patterns get enacted? Well, usually something happens on the outside, sometimes on the inside, but most of the time it happens on the outside. So if we go back to the 4 brain modes, I might put Brian down. I might pick him up a bit later. So when you do something that's new, novel, or different, okay, there are no internal patterns. The brain's got no choice but to use the conscious mind. But it's slow, it uses lots of energy, so it doesn't want to do it unless it's absolutely necessary. That's why it typically only does it for 5% of the time. Right? So what happens to the rest of the 95%? Well, all that stuff happens with the other 3 modes. And the main one tends to be autopilot. So the majority of the time, the stuff that we've done plenty of times before, we've got a habit. That's the sort of layman's terms that gets used. We've got a habit that determines the response. Now, that's quick, that uses minimal energy, it's very efficient, so the brain wants to use that in preference to anything else, and it uses it even if there isn't a very good match. That's kind of the default program, if you like. So let me give you an example. So you've texted and driven, so you text and drive, you've done it for a few months now, you haven't had any incident. What you've done is you've built in there an internal pattern, a scripted response to you hearing the ping on your phone. You will go and do something automatic when the ping happens. Now, when the ping happens, that information gets fed to the conscious mind, but the conscious mind is saying, look, you've done it 1,000 times before, right? Nothing bad ever seems to happen, and you're already on the way to looking at your mobile phone. So I'm not going to scrutinize it because the past determines future behavior. So I'm just going to let it through. And that's typically what happens. So we go from the subconscious to the conscious, but when we're in autopilot, the conscious doesn't really get all that much engaged because there's a lot of history that nothing bad's ever happened. So what happens when rushing and frustration come in? Now, we mentioned about the fact that you get these chemicals in your brain that sideline the conscious mind. So when you're running late, socially, you don't want to be known as somebody that runs late all the time. So what tends to happen is that you tend to, say if you're driving, you tend to speed. Now that decision gets fed to the conscious mind, but the conscious mind doesn't have enough blood in order to process it. So it can't do anything about it, and you end up behaving impulsively. Right? What about with fatigue? Well, with fatigue, the whole brain is sort of clogged up. Your brain is mush, if you like.
And your willpower can go to zero if
Right.
somebody puts something in, like your ability to fight off a bad decision when you're tired. Like, why,
Yeah.
I can, how many times, oh, just
Nothing.
give me, salad or fries. Oh, I'll take the fries, anyhow.
Yeah. So what happens is that there is an internal pattern that says, your brain knows it's running low on energy, and it also knows that the best way to get you across to the other side is to get you to sleep, even if that involves getting in a car and driving home. But when that piece of decision gets fed to the conscious mind, that conscious mind doesn't have the energy to scrutinize it and to deal with it. And it understands that you need to get some sleep, so it allows you to do the driving. Plus, you've done it 1,000 times before and you're still here, so you must be doing something right.
Too cold to sleep in the car. I have to at least drive to a hotel. Might as well just drive home. Well, it goes on and on.
Exactly. Yeah. So those are the four brain modes, and and this kind of belief that everything is conscious or can be made conscious, when you start to understand what's actually happening in people's heads, it's not that simple, right? So how
Well,
does
no,
safety deal with
because
it?
Christian, I was speaking at a aluminum extruders conference last week, and a big focus was on fatigue risk management, and so on. And I said, but guys, ultimately, you've got to accept that fatigue management is a personal affair. Like, you really know when you're too tired. But
Mm,
the whole idea that this is only fixable with sleep is not accurate. You can fix it with brisk exercise, like you said,
mm,
for a while, right?
yeah.
Like, if you were running from the bloody enemy, like it was in the old days, I mean, you will stay awake, and you will keep run. If you keep your body moving, it's not like you can't manage fatigue, right? It
Mhm.
doesn't. But the idea that somebody can manage it for you, I think, is incredibly inefficient.
Oh, I tend to agree. It's an option, but you know, so let me sort of go through and sort of I'll grab Brian again over here. So how does safety deal with the way that the brain functions, right? So what safety does is it goes, okay, um, fix the environment, take the hazard out, improve the system, or strengthen the resolve of the conscious mind. And that works, but it works up to a point. The problem with that approach is it never addresses where most of our behavior originates, which is in here, right? So
Mhm.
that's what I call third generation safety. First generation is about the system and giving people knowledge. Second generation is about having conversations with people about how important safety is. Those two things are important, and we're going to continue to do those, but there's a piece missing. It's incomplete. Right? So what we also need to do is we also need to rewire some of these internal patterns for them to be automatically safer. So at the moment, your subconscious, because most of it involves inattention, is not working for your safety. But if we rewire those internal patterns to be safer, then your subconscious works for your safety. And the good news is that once you wire it into the subconscious, it's effortless, right? You
Yes,
don't have to think about it. You don't need a checklist. You don't need a procedure. You don't need anything. It just happens.
I used to use that example, Christian. I mean, dating myself, but we didn't always have a seatbelt law. When the seatbelt law came in, I was somewhat resentful because I'd been living in California driving a motorcycle where you didn't even need to have a helmet. But anyhow, it was a $54 fine, and I didn't have a lot of money, so I started buckling up. And a couple of years later, I fell asleep at the wheel, and the police officer said, if you didn't have your seatbelt on, you probably wouldn't be here.
Mm,
And I mean, or definitely a lot worse for sure. But I didn't remember putting the seatbelt on that night. So I used to say to
yeah,
the class, if I don't remember doing it, how much effort was it? I mean, if I
yeah.
asked you to come over and help me move my whole apartment this weekend, chances are you'd notice the effort, and so would I. But
Mm,
if at the end of it, I don't even remember putting it on, then it's effortless, right? So to a
exactly.
certain extent, it's much more efficient in the long run, right?
Yep. Yeah, it takes a bit of time and effort to get it to be effortless, but once you do, it kind of works on your benefit, right?
What
It helps you be safer.
what in terms of people, I say this to them all the time. I mean, they want well, first of all, everybody, maybe just a little bit from our side. You make a program that's 20 hours long, people will say, can you do it in 10? You make one that's 10, they say, can you do it in 5? You make one that's 5, they'll say, can you do it in 2? And then they'll say, can you do a 30-minute overview for our senior guys because they don't have much time. So it won't matter what you say. Everybody will, for whatever reason, seem to want to think that they can do it. They can do it in less time. And so finally I've come to them and said, well, you can't really argue with the neuroscience, you guys. I don't think you can learn how to play the piano in 5 minutes. And I don't think you can learn a new language fluently in 10 minutes either. And I don't think you can learn how to play squash, badminton, golf, football, whatever it is in 5 minutes. You can't learn how to play golf in 5 minutes. But for some reason, you think you can rewire everybody's safety brain so that they'll always follow all procedures all the time, wear all the gear all the time. And if they do that, our omnipotent safety system is going to prevent all of the injuries where kinetic energy is involved. And you're just going, no, it won't. But what's a realistic time frame, Cristian, for these guys to kind of get their head around? Like, is 10 hours, how much does it take to sort of rewire those pathways with people? Everybody's heard 28 days, 31.
It varies on the habit, I think. So the research I've read is anything between 20 to 180 days, depending on what you want to do, whether it's something you can piggyback on an existing habit or it's something new, how complex it is. But the issue that I have with most people is they tend to say to me things like, and this is because, they think that safety is a deliberate choice. We'll just tell them, and once they know, they'll do it. So,
Yeah.
I try to explain to them, I said, what we want them to do is 10% of the effort. I can do that in half an hour or an hour. That's not difficult, right? But most of the game, most of what we're trying to get people to do is we need to try and wire it in. And to wire it in, knowledge, which is directed at the conscious mind, doesn't help because all the wiring takes place in the subconscious. So it's trying to get them to cross to that field and to realize, like you said, we're talking about a skill and a habit, right? Play the piano or learn a new language or all that kind of stuff. It's through repetition that you actually get that. So the interesting thing for what we do is that depending on what we're getting them to do, we ask them to do it of a certain duration. So, for things that are really complicated, we say to them, because sometimes people choose their own habit. They say to me, well, how long do I have to do in order for this to take place? And what I say to them is, well, how do you know that it's habit? And they look at me kind of funny. And I go, so how would you feel if you got in your car and you didn't put your seatbelt on? Or how would you feel if you went out into the plant and you didn't put your PPE on? And they'd look at me and they go, well, it feels uncomfortable. And I go, okay, so when you don't do it and it feels uncomfortable, then it's a habit.
It's also something I tell people, you use it as a trigger. It will, because it's different. Your RAS lights up. Okay. You can always choose to ignore it. It's a bit like the little voice. You can choose to ignore it, but you should also realize you don't get it all the time. So pay attention. You can use it, investigate it. You can decide whether it's real or not. But don't blow it off, because I've talked to too many people who wish they didn't. The other thing, I guess, that's part of it, Cristian, is how many times a day. Like, I did this just as an experiment, but I had a sling on my my left arm.
Right.
A ski accident. I ripped a tendon, bicep tendon off the bone, and so I had my watch in my right hand. But I look at my watch a lot because traveling, running, going around, and traveling with an arm in a sling and being a safety expert is really credible for the customs guy. Let me tell you,
I'm sure it is.
I'm going in. I'm going in to do a speech for the National Safety Council. Well, it doesn't look like you got it all figured out. Anyhow, um, but it didn't take me, I think, about 4 days to quit looking at my left wrist for nothing for the watch, right? So I think, you know, part of it's also how many times a day are you relearning the new habit is also, you know, going to have an, you know, so it gets probably to the number of repetitions. I have no idea though if you stray back. In other words, like if you cheat on your new habit of holding the hand, I don't know, that's maybe a bit trite. Then it's going to probably set you back even further. But I don't know how many times. So it's really important if you want to get to where it's free efficiently that, you know, you don't deviate, because I think you kind of go back to zero or close to it.
Well, when you think about habits, they're just neural pathways, neural circuitry, right? And the brain allocates real estate based on use. So if you want to change to a new habit, don't do the old habit and make yourself do the new habit deliberately as much as you can. That's the best recipe. Every time you allow the old habit to come into play, then essentially you are giving it reason for the real estate not to get demolished as quickly as it potentially could.
Yeah, it's interesting being, you know, being back in New York, seeing, you know, Broadway, remembering some of my earlier acting days and advice I got from a director once, which is, if you're going to be an actor, Larry, try as much as you can not to do things the same way every day, because if you get so set in your ways and in your habits, you'll never be able to play somebody else.
Yeah, lack of flexibility.
Because your hand always moves like this. Every movie, it's always the same. And, you know, we've all seen actors that, you know, yeah, the script changes, but they're the same guy every movie, right? You know, whereas there's others well, there's others though that can take on a completely different persona, you know, where you're actually going, I can't believe that's the same, you know, that's the same I mean, I know it's the same person, but I can't believe they did that, you know, so well.
Yeah.
You know, they were the good guy and they could play the bad guy. Very unusual. But that's another thing that I talk about too, Cristian, which is the power of the subconscious mind is huge. It's like the supercomputer, and your prefrontal cortex, the part that makes you think you're so brainy, is actually, you know, like the old Commodore 64 kind of thing. Like, it can only manage about 4 variables in 4 situations. And so things like, should I marry this girl, become incredibly complicated. They even did experiments with, you know, with sofas and cars and things like that, where they gave people 4 variables and they could pick the best car. They gave them 12 variables and they got less than 25% of them. Like, we mean, less than random chance they got it right. So, but your subconscious can function quite often like a supercomputer, but it can only kind of communicate with, I don't know, with feelings. Like, you know, I got to sleep on it and I'll see how I feel in the morning. So how much does a strong emotional experience for your prefrontal cortex affect that subconscious, those neural pathways that you were talking about? Because we've all had experiences that we'll never forget as well too, right? So
Yeah.
how does that part all work, and how much does that improve the new pathways?
Okay. So something that is high in emotion, I guess, prepares the brain to tear down existing circuitry and build new one, right?
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, and when you talk about, you know, people making decisions, feelings comes first, right?
So
Then they,
is that how we override the logic?
yeah, then we create a
Oh,
story to justify the feelings, and the facts are the third thing, right? And most people do 1 and 2, and they don't bother with the third, especially these days where, you know, we're so busy that we kind of like intuitively, if it makes sense intuitively, then we tend to go with it. whereas I'm more the kind of guy that wants to see the evidence. And it reminds me of a saying that my dad used to tell me when I was 16, 17, and I never really appreciated it for what it was, back in those days. And he said to me, look, just because it makes sense to you, Christian, doesn't make it true. Where's the evidence, right? And that's really kind of stuck with me. And I've thought about it more lately than when he used to say it every second day. But that's what he was saying. He was saying, hey,
there is that part of
you,
it. Yeah, the parental advice.
yeah.
You want to talk about something getting filtered out because it isn't new? I heard it before. Okay. So.
That's right. But it was interesting because I was talking to a manager, a senior executive, and he was saying to me, they had an incident where a guy that assembles things drills holes for a living, drilled a hole through his hand. And he was saying to me, why can't they think more about their safety like I do when I'm at home? And I said to him, so how often do you pick up the drill at home? And he said, well, I pick up the drill at home, once a year, maybe once every couple of years. And he said, okay, so think about it this way. Same task, different brain mode. Right? For you, it's new, novel, or different. The conscious mind is in there, so it's easy to think about safety. For him, it's autopilot. He does it every day, 20 times a day, 30, 40, 50 times a day. So it's a totally different experience. He needs to override that internal pattern in order to get the conscious mind in the game. And it's not new, novel, or different. So it's hard to do, right? To try and get them to see that there's a bit of a difference here between, it's the same task, but what we use in order to get it done depends on our experiences. But the blue collar workers, the workers, they kind of get the autopilot thing really well. The safety sort of is more conscious thing. What I find is that the people that don't do repetitive tasks on an ongoing basis, mostly sort of managers and some safety professionals, tend to struggle with it a little bit more because it's not that consistent with their experiences, I guess, is the best way that I can do it, that
Right.
I can say. But when you step back and you think about this, the idea that behavior is all conscious or can be made to be more conscious, that's just out of date. It's pretty common and lots of people think it's true. But we live in a world where, monkey see,
It's a
monkey
fool's
do.
errand. It's a fool's errand, though. You can't stop yourself from going on autopilot. I mean, I'm really going to date myself here, but this is going back to the late 80s, and I would actually see how long it took an hour drive from where I live to the airport in Toronto.
Mm-hmm.
And I would see how far I could go hardest. Now, this road, in fairness to me here, this road may have 3 curves and it may have a couple of hills in the whole 2-hour stretch, and it's 2 lanes, then 3 lanes. So it's, it's not, there's nothing about the road that's going to force your consciousness unless it's crowded, the weather's bad or whatever. And I would see how far I could drive before I went on autopilot, which was always difficult because you'd have been on autopilot for a few minutes before you noticed. So you were never really sure where the stop line was. But I never made it past Coburg, which is 40 minutes.
Okay. Yep.
And the other thing I did when I got a big RV a couple summers ago, it was 39 feet, the size of a transport truck, a full bus. 6, my son and his roommates were going to California, and anyhow, you got to get a special license for this. And when I finally got it on the freeway, I looked at Shane, who was one of the other dads, and I said, and just every now and again, just sort of say something to me, I said, and I'll see right then. It took me an hour and a half to go from being scared to death, driving the biggest thing I'd ever driven on the freeway, to I'm just driving and talking to Shane and realizing that I'm just driving. So
yeah.
You've got, when people say, how could he get complacent with 13,800 volts? Aren't the same way you got complacent driving your car 60 miles an hour, 100 kilometers an hour. It's exactly the same process in your head, right?
Yeah.
And it's pretty much the same thing that makes Tiger Woods hit the ball pretty straight compared to me. It's all those neural pathways.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but what I want people to appreciate is that, we live in a monkey see, monkey do world, and the idea that safety is all conscious or can be to be made all conscious has been around for 50 years. So that's why it's caught on. But since 10 years ago, when all this neuroscience started coming out, up until 10 years ago, that was all we thought there was. But now we know better. And that's the whole thing about what I try and get people to understand is if now we know better, whenever we make the assumption that what they did was conscious, there's other things that we can ask in order for them to appreciate that maybe there was something else going on. And there's 4 brain modes. There's not one, right? There's 4 brain modes. Which of the other ones were involved, perhaps?
Well, you do. I mean, I watch you do this bit in your trainings. It's just, I think, brilliant where somebody is driving on the freeway. It's a shuttle van. You get to see the guy pull the phone out of his pocket, start texting somebody. Then there's a crash. And, you ask everybody, well, is this deliberate or is this a subconscious habit? And as we all watch it the second time, every one of us realizes that there was no decision made, that just everything that he did, how fluid it was, like all of the kinetic motions were also subconscious as well too, that went with this. So in the end we go, well, no, he did it looks like he deliberately pulls his phone out of his pocket to text when he's driving. But like you said before, if you watch it a second time and you look for some of those other things, you go, no. He's done this so many times, he can do stuff without looking at it. And so I'm sure if you can do it without looking at it, you're not questioning it anymore, or it's not a should I or shouldn't I anymore thing. And I think that to me I saw so many people, the lights come on when you would go through that bit with them and they'd go, oh my God, I was ready to hang this guy from the highest tree. And they are too,
They do.
Sometimes
they do.
But like, it's to me, it's not fixing the problem. It's also, I think, very singular for the people who are just had the most unfortunate outcomes. I mean, if everybody's doing it, and I would suggest that's a high 90%, the few people that actually have the tragic outcomes, to simply send those people to jail isn't really having much of a detrimental effect on the other people, is what I just say. Might look good, but I don't think it's fixing the problem at all.
No. And until we get a functional MRI that's portable enough to put in people's heads, we won't really be sure what's going on in there. But we can make an educated guess if we understand the neuroscience a little bit better and how it influences behavior. And really, that's kind of what I'm about, is trying to give people a different perspective. Because at the moment, the safety is a conscious decision thing is an incomplete picture of what drives behavior.
Well, there's still, I think there's still a very great perception out there, Cristian, that you can fix every problem if you just have committed leaders.
Well, there's caring, there's trust, there's healthy relationships, there's a whole bunch of things. I saw all that stuff go around 20 years ago. There was a thing called relationship-based safety, and it takes organizations, and look, and that's the thing that I was speaking about before, is that intuitively it makes sense. But it's all held together by the assumption that safety can be made to be totally conscious.
Yes. But I would just look at them and say, do you have children, sir?
Yeah.
And they go, yes. And I'd say, well, did you not care for them? Did you not love them? And they start looking at you like, how dare you? And you say, well, how many times a week did they get hurt when they were little? How many times did they get hurt when they were teenagers? And did you feel super confident saying, here's the card, have fun? I mean, and they go, no. And I'm going, well, so there's a limit to all of this. You can't do the looking, you can't do the thinking, and you can't keep the balance for them. Sorry. You got to learn how to do that stuff for yourself. So
true. So interestingly,
I find leadership stuff to be a little like how you could think that would get, certainly process safety, the resources for it, all the protective gear, making sure you have proper scaffolding, all of that, obviously, I don't think we're arguing with. I can't believe we still might be at this stage of the game in 2021. But that you can fix it all with good leadership, I think, is a total illusion. And I know that the leaders that I talk to are pretty on board. Like, what more do you want me to do, Larry? Kind of thing. And I'm like, hey, you're doing it.
Yeah. So I think leadership's an important piece, but it's been directed at trying to make safety more conscious. And that's only part of the solution, right? What I want leaders to do is to get a better understanding of what drives behavior so that they can help people manage those internal patterns better. Because you need leadership, you need coaching in order for people to change those internal patterns, because it's difficult to do by yourself. Right? So for me, leadership's important, and if you care and you trust, there's trust and there's healthy relationships, and you open the door to those conversations, I mean, that's a positive thing. I'm good with it.
Oh
But
yeah.
what are you trying to get people to do? If you're trying to get people just to make safety more conscious, then you've got an incomplete understanding of what drives behavior. So that's where I sort of struggle. And we
Well,
use
remember, Chris,
leadership.
you remember when we were heading out, I think, to Melbourne, from Sydney, and you stopped so I could get the picture, and it was a huge automotive plant company. And I mean, we are talking 20-foot letters. I mean, think safety. I mean, probably all in. I said this is a $5,000 to $10,000 paint job on the side of the building to put think safety on the side of the building. And I think that, like, I took the picture, still got it.
Yeah,
It's like a testament to exactly what you were saying. We can just get people to think about safety more often, we're going to win this war. But you're not really, because you're battling an internal gear that's designed to shut out all the stuff that's old and familiar so you can focus on the new stuff that'll kill you.
yeah.
You
Well, look,
surround yourself with stuff that can kill you on a familiar day-to-day basis, all of those things don't work for you anymore.
Yeah. So I think that if you could get people to think about safety all the time, then that's true. And if you have a view of the world that all behavior can be made to be conscious, then you can understand why people do that, right? But 10 years ago, that's all we thought we had. Now we know better. There's 4 brain modes, not just one. So let's try and help people manage the other 3 brain modes a little bit better, and then we'll get a much more complete picture of what drives behavior. And if you get people to do those things in a safer way, then incidents will drop. And that's really what I think it's all about. So we're kind of, I mean, all the things that we do for safety are with good intent, and I don't disagree. I don't think any of it is useless. But if it's just directed at making safety more conscious, then that's not the whole story. Let's
Yeah,
teach
I
people the
think.
rest of the story, and let's give them the tools to help other people manage those things better.
Okay. There's a question on the screen, and I sorry, I didn't see it before. I think it's from Jim Whiting or Whitting. When a
Oh,
task
Jim.
requires a procedure that, should it include some yeah, of course it should. Especially any kind. That's why we've got the procedure. I mean, the whole idea, when something's complicated more than a couple of things, you need to have a step-by-step,
Yeah.
and also help to
So
make.
if it's new, novel, or different, then definitely, right? But I'm not sure whether I used to be a certified auditor. Right? And I've seen procedures. I mean, there was a procedure on how people needed to walk so they wouldn't trip on anything, right? You kind of go, really? Yeah. Um, so yeah, it's
I
useful.
can't.
So if
I
we
really
can
can't.
understand,
I can't picture you as an auditor, Cristian. Really, I mean, you sitting there with the clipboard and the tick boxes and stuff like that, going, "Well, this is a joke. This is a joke. This is a joke. Well, this isn't going to work. Well, this won't matter." Anyhow, but I'm not trying to either make light of all of that stuff, because I sort of assume when I go to places that, you know enough to be able to sweep the floor and change the burned out light bulbs. And every now and again, I'm surprised that that kind of stuff even isn't happening. I did want to, this is one of the questions I wrote down, Cristian. Because when you investigate most serious incidents and fatalities at workplaces,
mhm,
they're was a piece of personal protective equipment or a standard procedure like lockout, tagout that wasn't used or employed. You know, the fall arrest harness was 5 feet away from the person, and there was a good anchor point 20 feet away, and the man fell to his death. So these things. Do you think then there's a natural, if you go backwards from the serious ones, where there were obvious decisions made to bypass known safety procedures, controls, etc. And you see this rampantly when you look at the data for workplace fatalities, because they include farming workplace fatalities in the United States and Canada. And so if you did it backwards, very strong indication that we need to get people to make better decisions about the 101, 202 life-saving things. Shoring trenches was another big culprit. Fall arrest, though, people falling out of buckets, treeing limbs. Another reason that graph isn't moving, Cristian, is because most of the fatalities are happening at companies with less than 50 employees. So they've never sent anybody at their company to a safety conference. They don't know what BBS is. They know what BS is, though, and they think safety, most of safety is, so it's I don't think that graph's ever going to come down unless we start targeting the companies that are having the fatalities. But the other thing is, I don't think it's going to come down if you keep chasing this. We're going to try to make everybody think safety 24/7. There is no way to do that efficiently, right? It's just not going to, you're all your hardwiring is going against that to try to habituate it. So I don't know if it's fair to ask you this, Cristian, like, could you give, okay, so somebody's saying, listen, I need to bring this, but I also need to bring the application of this into my workforce so that, rubber meets the road. We actually get some traction. Can you kind of give us a 1, 2, 3 or something like that, or a step-by-step for how they could go about it?
So you're talking about people breaching and that being interpreted as a deliberate act.
No, I was talking about a company where, they would like to start harnessing a little bit of what you're talking about, start making changes in the right direction, and start defocusing away from trying to make safety, think safe. Like, in other words,
conscious thing.
I guess we could start by taking the sign off the side of the wall, but then what are people going to think if we do that and we don't explain it?
Exactly.
We just don't care about safety now. So we're going to have to sort of use that as an opportunity to say, well, wait a minute, there's neuroscience, and, we're not going to be able to win this war just by trying to get you folks to think safety all the time, because, we now realize this isn't going to work.
Yeah. So look, that's why I wrote the book, right? To give people a first chance, a first pass chance at having a look at the 4 brain modes, and getting people a different perspective that there are other things in play, right? But at the end of the day, the book gives you the what to do, which is kind of 10% of what you need. How to engage the subconscious in order for people to start changing those internal patterns is where all the work needs to be done. And unless you get a program that takes you through the process, it's difficult to get that done just by telling people, right? Because you can tell people to be more careful, you can tell people not to rush, not to get frustrated, but it doesn't really help them deal with it any better. And in my experience, about 20% of the workforce will grab these things for themselves. And even if we did nothing else, they will run with it because they can see a benefit for themselves and they can see a benefit for their families. It's amazing what people will do for their children that they won't do for themselves.
Right. Well, that's what I found. I asked that to everybody. How many care more about your kids and your family than yourself? And everybody puts their hands up. And then I listen to safety pros and managers saying we want them to go home safe to their families. And I'm like, Well, it's not their safety they're worried, it's their family safety they're worried about. You guys, you're missing the point, right? You're playing the card
Yeah,
incorrectly. Um,
yeah,
but
yeah.
Christian, the idea that you've got to get the people like this, the first step is opening your eyes and
Hmm.
looking at the opportunities and potentially, not going any further down a road that isn't likely going to get you somewhere. And then you mentioned there's the application, right? So
Yeah.
um, I know that you do different forms of training. Obviously, a lot of safe start training in
Yep.
Australia as well too. And again, that was designed to sort of, build the repetition and the emotion. Then
Hmm.
hopefully you get some good stories so that things
Hmm.
connect a bit quicker. Um, is there anything else that you do with Habit Safe in addition to that you recommend to people, or maybe, well, yeah, we do, Larry, but actually we sell it, so I don't necessarily sure I got.
There's that part of it, but
Yeah,
so when people say to me, what is it that when you distill it down, Christian, what is it that you do? Well, what we do is we try to have the best understanding of how the subconscious works so that we can talk to it and get it to change those internal patterns without making the conscious mind, without pissing off the conscious mind. That's really where the balance lies, right?
yeah,
And it's and
and
it's
it's
not.
such a,
I can't say to you, look, you got to do these three things because it's all kind of interconnected, right? And there's a good deal of it in Safe Start too, right? But that's really, people say to me sometimes, you go, oh, look, your day rate is a bit higher than what we normally pay for a safety consultant. And I say to them, well, you're not paying me for what I'm doing today. You're paying me for the last 15 years of research that enables me to do this in the way in which we do it, right? So what people pay for is the experience that you have in getting people to look at the world differently and also to engage in a way that will entice them to practice more than would otherwise be the case rather than less. Um,
yeah,
so what I yeah, I can't. I mean, I know in my mind the kind of things that I need to do, but it's a ever moving picture too, right? There are things that the neuroscience tells us. We try them, they don't work. We yank it out and throw it away, right? If the evidence doesn't back what we're actually sort of being told by the science, then we don't use it. So it's
well,
all about what's effective and what's not.
I was going to say that the real world is actually a little crueler and sometimes much swifter than the scientific world. It can take a while to scientifically disprove that something doesn't work, but if it doesn't get the results you claim in the marketplace,
Oh,
it
look,
does. So like I said, it wasn't surprising to me that the stuff that worked was substantiated by the neuroscience, because it
yeah,
wouldn't have been around that long if it hadn't. I mean, I've seen lots of different offerings come and go. I've also seen offerings on the neuroscience for training where, just telling people about how their brain worked would likely be enough for them to change. And I think what we all saw is that those things are just about dead and gone now. You may if you contact some of them directly, but it's not the kind of stuff that's being promoted anymore, interestingly enough. So
yeah. So
the this
what?
last part is the application, Christian. How to
Yeah.
how do you apply the neuroscience to get the improvement?
Yeah. So what I have found that I have seen when people talk about the neuroscience is that they usually explain the neuroscience well enough. uh, but when they look at the solution, they go back to fix the environment, improve the system, or make safety more conscious. And sometimes they use the neuroscience to shore up their assumptions and not change what they believe. So a lot of the neuroscience I see is directed at leadership, but it's still pointed towards the safety is a more conscious thing, right? So for me, it's not about just leaders. So I get that you got to have healthy relationships and you've got to be able to talk to people. And if you care and there's trust, then that's easier to do. But what I'm about is, what do you have the conversation about? Do you have the conversation about the hazard? Do you have the conversation about improving the system? Do you have the conversation about, making safety more conscious? Or do you have the conversation about, was it autopilot? Was it rushing, frustration, or fatigue? And that last bit is not something that gets done unless they've done, safe start or something similar. And that's, I think, where the biggest opportunity for improvement is.
Yeah, no, I obviously I agree with you totally. But I saw somebody who posted something on social media saying the neuroscience proves that you can't beat complacency. Huge letters, ... And then it said, so we need to change the system. And I was in one of those moods, and I just said, let me know how you're making out with the gravity and the kinetic energy. I won't hold my breath.
Well, interestingly enough, I mean, I've done about 200 incident investigations in my day, and the ones that have done most recently is people running into things that are meant to be there, right? Why did he run into the pole? Why did he step on the paver that was a bit wonky? Why did he trip over the gutter? They're all things that are meant to be there, right?
Well, I remember the first time you did this thing when you said somebody turns into a door and breaks a tooth and cuts themselves, the recordable injury. Is the door a hazard? And you watched for the first time, you saw people just, what about the wall? You ever turned into the wall? Is the wall a hazard? Now, what about the concrete pylon that's supporting the bridge and you hit that in your motorcycle at 60 miles an hour? Was that concrete was the concrete pillar a hazard? And I've gotten so many people to open their eyes with just those few examples that I got from you, Cristian. So, again, thanks so much for that.
I got a lot from you too, Larry.
Oh, well, cheers, Matt. No. And remember, Cristian, what happens on the road stays on the road.
I'm trying to forget it, actually.
Couple road trips all over the country for sure. Anyhow, Mike, is there any other questions? I saw the one there. Anything else? I know we're well over the hour. I know we got an hour and a half in total, but anything else that we should probably try to answer while Cristian's here?
No, fascinating discussion. I mean, we're a little bit over, but I think the first question I'll go back to was a good one. Just give me a second to pull it up. It starts with, sorry, one sec. This one quickly was one that I don't think, all the rest I think you were able to answer, but this one, is there a way or means for people to identify their state of mind that might help them to identify their level of risk? So state of mind and level of risk.
Rate your state. Just easy. Rushing, frustration, fatigue, complacency. Yeah, I mean, complacency, I don't know, it's a continuum, right, Cristian? So, I mean, at the first stage of complacency, you go to autopilot is the way I explain it. Second stage is where you never question what you're doing unless something changes or bad happens. But just ask people on a scale of 1 to 10, how are you doing right now? You could normally start it off supervisor to employee engagement process, but eventually, well, this is sort of like my mantra, eventually you've got to get the people to do it for themselves, which means that the value of doing it has to be intrinsic and it can't be supported by the contest, props, penalties, quotas, anything else. It's got to be, I do this, like I brush my teeth because I believe it's a good thing to do and I want to do it, all that sort of stuff, right? So before you start a task, can you get people to rate their state and just ask themselves on a scale from 1 to 10, how are you doing? How am I doing today? And you can even, if you use Cristian's Autopilot, because I think it's a little more helpful maybe, Can you predict when you'll likely be on autopilot today? And then set an alarm and then rate your state at that time. And that'll help to bring you a little more back into the moment and a little more situational awareness and a little more focus. So you can't really stop your mind from going off task, but you can efficiently bring your mind back on task if you use a few simple tools like setting an alarm in your phone, which wasn't so easy for our ancestors 1,000 years ago. Even, a couple hundred years ago, carrying an alarm clock around with you was a little bit of a burden. But it's not a big deal now. A lot of people can just do it right on their watch. So, it's not, and it's certainly, so this whole idea that human error is inevitable is true, but human error is to a certain extent predictable if you go to those 4 states of mind or 4 states of the brain that Cristian was talking about, and you start paying attention to those things that cause the errors. So what would you say, Cristian, in terms of
I'm good with the way you explained it.
I know you guys use rate your state as well too, but I mean, I think that's part of it, right? Go out there.
So look, the way that I kind of see, I see a lot of people saying that they see autopilot specifically as a bug in the system of human behavior. So they try and stop people from going on autopilot. And when they can't, they throw their hands up in the air and they go, it happens in people's heads. There's nothing we can do about it unless you start blaming, right? Not true, right? The problem is that autopilot is not a bug in the system. Autopilot is the system, right? Or the vast majority of the system. So unless you deal with autopilot, right? Unless you deal with autopilot on its own merits, right? By getting people to migrate to safer habits, then it's going to be difficult to detect and it's going to be difficult to manage, and it's going to continue to put yourself in situations where maybe you won't be able to avoid as many incidents as you would otherwise.
Very much. Like some of the habits you're talking, like that Cristian's talking about, everybody, we like move your eyes first before you move your hands, feet, body, or car. Test your footing or grip before you commit your weight. Look for line of fire potential, corners, blind alleyways, like those sorts of things, so that you can get in the habit of having your senses. Your eyes are great, but they're not going to do you any good if you're not looking where you need to be looking, right? So looking for things that could cause you to lose your balance, traction, or grip. So when we talk about harnessing the power of the subconscious, that's if your paradigm was, again, the decision thing, hopefully you can sort of see how some of these things would really help in terms of improving safety and unintentional injuries, acute injuries. So it's those kinds of habits, Anything else, Mike, before we should sort of close out? But
no, thank you. This has been absolutely fascinating. I love the neuroscience bit, and I think the resetting the default pattern, I've really found a lot of value in this personally. But a lot of great questions, Zach Ali, Bob Arnold, Jim Whitting, and I think a lot of these you've been able to answer. A lot of them were around conscious versus unconscious behavior for leaders too. So thank you very much. And I'm going to sign off and let you guys wrap it up.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Thanks much. And Cristian, again, thank you so much for being on the show, but for everything, man. I mean, in terms of all the stuff that you brought to the table, it's helped us all out all over the world with Safe, starting with Australia. And now that we're almost allowed to travel free and clear and come back, at least this week, Cristian. Maybe I can get down. I can get down there, and we can do a bit of a tour in Southeast Asia there in Australia coming up. But it'd be great to see you again. Thanks so much.
I like that.
Yeah. So the next show, everybody, is, I should have this sort of more or less right in front of me. I think it is December the 9th, and it is with Peter Betroni. And we are going to be talking about engaging the first line supervisor and things that have actually worked out there in the field. This is another one of these subjects kind of near and dear to my heart, because I spent the first probably 12, 15 years training supervisors how to make positive, non-punitive safety observations. And I think that I'm still alive sort of points to that I must have been relatively good at it. But you want to talk about something that'll only take you so far, right, Cristian? I mean, that's another great example of this skill. There is, just like with your kids, there is a handoff of, I can't do the looking, I can't do the thinking, I can't keep your balance for you, but I can at least help you learn concepts, techniques that can, help you when you're rushing, help when you're frustrated. And I can encourage you to work on some of those safety related habits to help compensate for autopilot, right?
Yep.
I mean, the easiest one is driving on autopilot. Make sure you leave a little more following distance, because auto's not so quick, right? He's good, but he's not so quick. All right, Cristian, thank you again. Really appreciated it. I could talk with you. Everybody can probably figure out. These guys probably talked the whole 2-week trip, and then, they were talking at the airport on the phone before he actually got on the plane. So thanks so much, Cristian. Good to see you soon.
All right, Larry, likewise. Thank you.
Okay, bye-bye, everybody.